briefly about your life before you became involved with SIM.
Thanks, Pat. Life begins in the IT. It's always been associated with the IT world, one way or the other. And the word that comes to my mind when I look at the overall career is the word of synchronicity. Somehow career planning is all tied up with opportunities, and do you recognize them when they happen? I began my career by doing a favor for the placement director at Northwestern, where I was going for an MBA. And one day he asked me to sign up for an interview with a company coming on campus. And I told him, I said, at the time, Earl, I'm not sure why I want to do that. I've got 8 more months of school. And by the way, I don't even know what I want to be when I grow up. And so he said, please sign up because I got to fill their dance card, otherwise they don't come back on campus. So I said, fine, and I signed up. By the way, Earl, what's the name of the company? And he pulls the card out of his pocket and he says, International Business Machines. And I looked at him and I said, who are they, Earl? And he said, I think they do typewriters. So I signed up for them, and the half-hour interview went for 90 minutes. I signed up back with them in the fall when they came back on campus, and I went to work for them. And that took me out to Iowa, where I went on what they called the quota territory as a salesperson, and had 20-some accounts out in Iowa and Illinois and one little county in Missouri. And that was quite a good experience, enjoyed that very much. While I was out there, I belonged to an association called DPMA, Data Processing Management Association. That was the way I got to know all of my account managers in that territory. And then we moved on to Michigan, and I went to work for Touche Ross. Back then it was known as Touche Ross, Bailey and Smart. Bailey and Smart seem to have gone bye-bye, and now it's Deloitte Touche. But I worked for them for a whole bunch of years, traveled all over the place, and realized one day when my then 3-year-old son was shying away from me that Dad was out of town just too much, and so I had to leave them. But while I was in the Detroit area, I belonged, instead of DPMA, went to join ASM, Association for Systems Management. SIM didn't exist back then. And so I belonged to them, left Touche Ross because I was out of town too much, and I certainly didn't want my son shying away from me. So out of townness stopped that job. Worked for an automotive parts manufacturer in what was then the equivalent of a CIO, because that title didn't exist back then. And left them and came to work for Digital Equipment Corporation here in the Boston area. Had a great 16 years with them. That's when I started to find SIM. And I think it was Eve Arkush that invited me to join SIM. Best I can tell, it was probably, I went to work for Digital in 1976. Best I can tell, probably joined SIM late 70s, early 80s, maybe 80 or 81, something of that sort. I had become the program manager in SIM. That's the one who had to get the guest speakers. Back then, our chapter only had luncheons at 10 luncheons a year, so it didn't have July and August. Life was a lot simpler in our chapter back then, as opposed to the 47 events that they host now. So when I became president in '85, that was a simple job to do. The tough job was getting all the guest speakers. But we had the annual conference for SIM in Boston when I was, I think I was called chairman back then, and we now call it president. And we had a great year. That was the first year that SIM actually had sponsors for the annual conference. We held it at the aquarium downtown Boston. It was a great hit. And having worked for Digital, I was able to secure a bunch of funding for the big celebration night, and that was nice. That was helpful. So I worked for them, took the early retirement out of there, and because decks started to go downhill after, unfortunately. So how did I get involved with the RLF, coming all the way from there? It turned out that there were two of my colleagues, Warren Harkness and Brad Sweet, who saw what Dick Dooley was doing, who's the creator of RLF. They were running a pilot for SIM out in Chicago. So Hark and Brad came back to the Boston chapter and said, let's create a task force and see whether or not it makes sense for Boston to offer that to its membership. So Stu Stokes and I joined Brad and Hark, went over all the materials one day, and looked at it, concluded, yes, this makes sense. Let's do one here in Boston. So, okay. Back then, by the way, it was called the Chapter Hosted Learning Forum. And it was fashioned after what Dick had been doing with his leadership learning forum he did in his own home out in outside Chicago. So, okay, now who's going to run it? Well, my colleagues and friends from SIM, knowing that I was trying to figure out how to become an independent consultant and that I was not particularly billable at the time, three sets of eyeballs looked down the table, looked at me and said, hey Bart, why don't you do this? And I looked at him, very naive and innocent, and said, oh, okay, why not? I'll give it a shot. I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into. Absolutely none. I had no idea there were 30-some books to read. I had no idea what the facilitator role was going to be. None of that in my mind. Oh boy, what a great move that was. It's been the best thing I could have done in my life, job-wise. So, where do we go from there? Well, I had to figure out how we're going to put this thing together, so I called on Ralph Lofton, another SIM person, a good friend of mine. He had done a bunch of teaching. So we spent some time trying to figure out what the purpose was, what the mission was, what we were trying to accomplish, how would we know if we were successful. And we dismissed the whole idea that we were trying to make CIOs. That was not the purpose. If the only person we were trying to make was a CIO, we're blowing it, because we need leadership throughout the organization, not just the person at the top of the pyramid. So we figured out that what we're really trying to accomplish was to help somebody discover his or her leadership style. And that's a bigger thing than just trying to get the head person to become a more effective leader. So that's where we went from there. And we've been doing it now for 25 years in the Northeast. And the Northeast has had over 1,000 people go through the program.
Can you tell us what a typical session of the RLF was then and what it is now? And how do they differ?
First of all, you need to know that the role of a facilitator in the RLF is exactly that, to facilitate, not to preach, not to lecture, not to deliver today's lesson like you would assume in like a college course. In fact, what is done is driven by the participants themselves. They drive the discussions. They facilitate the discussions. So we have what is known as this huge box of books that gets delivered. In the very first class, I think we had 32 books, something of that sort. The program goes about 9 months, and we have 6 two-day sessions, and they're very intensive, and the participants drive the discussion on those books and additional topics that deal with leadership. One of the initial things we started when Ralph and I sat down, we tried to figure out what was the mission, what's the purpose, what are we trying to accomplish with this thing called Regional Leadership Forum, and its original names way back in the history. One of the things that we questioned was, are we trying to build new CIOs? And clearly you could measure that and determine whether you had success or not. But we said, no, that's not our purpose. If some happen to come out of that, terrific. But what we really wanted was to build the leadership capabilities at all levels, not just the one person at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. So our drive was to help people discover their own leadership style, whatever that is. If we knew what that meant, if we knew the top 10 things to do to become an effective leader, I would have published that book a long time ago. And I wouldn't be sitting here, I'd be off in Bora Bora or someplace else, because that's not the way it is. It's a very individualistic thing. So if I go back to that very first class, having not knowing how this was supposed to really work, and being maybe one chapter ahead of the people in the class in my own reading of this, it was fascinating to watch the change that went about with the people. Now, one of the rules in the class, in the typical class, you have to operate with a Vegas rule. What gets said in that room has to stay in that room, because we have to have total honesty in what somebody is thinking. The power in that room, by the experience of the people sitting around that table, is very, very strong, and they learn from each other. Adults learn best from each other, not from a lecture, but by sharing their own experience and their own knowledge. And that's kind of the learning model of the RLF. It was that way in the first session. It has been that way in the 25th session that we're doing. So we go through this experience of sharing, and some of the things that are different, we still read books. We've read as many as 40 in 1 year, and we've been down to 32 this current year. One of the things that's different in the first year, think about the technology. Maybe half the class had emails, the other half didn't have any emails. One of the assignments that I gave to the class in the first year, come forth with an inventory of the people in your personal network. They were offended by my asking them to do that. They looked at that as being very selfish. They looked at that and said, hey, that's out of bounds. We don't do that kind of thing. Today, people understand the power of a personal network, and they look at that as a good thing, not as a negative. It's quite different. The whole thinking of what is leadership all about. When you think of 1994, and you look at how many books were really written about leadership versus management, not so many. Today, it fills all the shelves in the bookstores. Leadership is quite a different thing. We know more about it. We've studied a lot more about it. So that's some of the differences. The other part of this, one of the things when we first started, there were no cell phones in the room. Along the way someplace, all of a sudden we had cell phones. Well, what happens when a cell phone goes off in the middle of class when you're digging deep into some personal topic? So up comes another practice that we have. If it rings, you sing. What's that mean? Well, darn thing goes off, you got to stand up and sing a song to the rest of the class. We love it. It's a lot of fun. The nice thing about it is, as a facilitator, I don't worry about policing that because the whole class does it. I can't tell you how many times we've had Happy Birthday and Row, Row, Row Your Boat sung to the whole class, and a few other songs. But that's one of the practices that we now have. If you look at where we were when we started versus today, I think we talk a lot more today about self-awareness, self-confidence, and how that impacts a person's ability to be an effective leader. The more confident you are, the more aware of who you are, what your priorities are, how you make decisions, the stronger you are as a leader, the more apt people are to follow you. So I think that's the difference. The curriculum, we have different books. We probably have 10 or 12 books that we had on the list in 1994, they're still on the list today. They're classics. We've changed some of the books over the years, yes. Some are more current. Topics are the same. What's the difference between a manager and a leader? How do you find balance in your life between your professional life, your personal life, your own personal time versus your family? Those are classic. The people are faced with those all the time. What's the typical time? It's pretty intense. Those 2 days that we come here at Babson, we start pretty early on the first day and we go until 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. We start at 7:30 the second day and go to 4 in the afternoon. They're intense. And people start to understand who they are. And that's the purpose. You know, there was a time when I was in a golf outing and I'm playing with a CIO of one of our sponsoring companies. And he stood on the tee and he said to me, "By the way, what do you guys do to these people?" And I looked at him and I said, "Why, what's the matter?" He said, "Well, Charlie," and I'm using fictitious names right now, "Charlie's quite different. His people are coming to me and asking, what's wrong with Charlie?" And it turns out that what they were talking about was Charlie's very different. He's working differently. He's operating differently. He's actually listening to us. He's actually caring about our opinion. He's a very different guy. We like what we see. And I looked at him and I said, "Is that wrong?" He said, "Heck no, how many seats can I get in next year's forum?" That's the kind of feedback we get. And that's what makes the difference. One of the joys I have, and I know the other facilitators that do this as well, one of the joys you get out of doing this, you see the so-called imaginary light bulb go off in the sessions, and somebody gets it. And you can see it just dawns on them what this is about. And they understand what they're looking for. And they come out of that session knowing a lot more about themselves. And that raises their self-confidence. So I don't know if I'm giving you the flavor of what a session's like, but it's pretty personal.
You also have CIOs coming and speak to the class, correct?
That's true. That's true. We have, each session we have 2 guest speakers. They're CIOs or business executives. We ask them to come in and share with the class what their story is. How did they become so successful? We ask them to share with the class what experiences they've had. And it is, again, the Vegas rule applies so that they can be as open as possible. They are looking for, the class is looking for nuggets of wisdom and experience. And it becomes a dialogue. This is not a PowerPoint presentation. They're looking for what kind of style does this person follow as a leader? Because they're all different. You know, the way you lead and the way I lead is going to be different because we're very different people. So the question is, what would this person have done differently if they had a chance? What's their greatest source of learning? What advice would they give these people who are trying to determine how to be more effective as leaders? So it's a very interesting experience, and when we get feedback from the participants about the different guest speakers, you get this, "Boy, I'd work for that person in a heartbeat," or "No way would I work for that one." And so you look at them and you say, well, what are the things that you're learning? And do you do it that way? Would you do it that way? So they're kind of like a 1-hour role model that you get insight of. And it's very effective. So they get experience and exposure to about a dozen of them in the overall time period.
How do you get those CIOs to agree to come in and bare their souls?
You ask them. Some of them are sponsors. Some of them actually want to come back. They feel like it's sort of their giving back in their own career. Some of them understand the importance of leadership development and developing their own leaders to follow them. But most of the time it's an appeal which says, yeah, I think I can do something to help develop more leaders, especially in the IT field. I don't think we've ever had, at least I don't remember being turned down. And I would say of the 25 years I've been doing this, I think there's only one that I would not invite back. They are all very effective. They've all got very different stories. And so you ask them to just share their stories. And from CIOs to CEOs to COOs, they're fascinating stories. As one of them once said, we've all got our own story. The question is, are you willing to share it? And what did you learn from it? Are you willing to share that with up-and-coming, high-potential people? You need to remember that when we look at who's a candidate to go through RLF, we're looking for the high-potential people. We're not looking for remedial problems where we got to fix the person. We've had a couple of those come through, and we've had to deal with that. That's not our function. Our function is to work with the high-potential people. And when we have those people, they know what the questions are to ask. And we've had a couple of those that have slipped in that have needed fixing. And they're tough.
I think that's one of the biggest secrets of SIM is that the people at the top are so interested in giving back.
Yes.
Giving back to the people that they want to encourage to become better people.
I think that's true in SIM, and I found it even with the non-SIM, non-IT business executives have the same sense of giving back. And I think they look back over their shoulder and look at their own career. I think most of us who've been facilitators do the same thing. We look at our own careers and say, what have I learned? If you look at the facilitators of RLF, I think that's why we do it year after year. We see it as a giving back. The whole career in the IT field has been very rewarding for all of my colleagues who do facilitating in RLF. And I think we do it because we get this personal reward and satisfaction of watching people get it, learning from it, coming out the other end, if you will, of the process, a better person. I once had a card, a thank you card sent to me by one of the participants. And the card read, I want to thank you for the RLF experience because I think I am a better employee for the company that sent me. I'm a better husband to my wife and a better father for my kids. What else do you need? How do you feel as a facilitator? Want to do it again? You bet. You want me to sign up for next year's class? You bet. You get that kind of thank you. I've had stories about spouses wanting to thank me because their husband came out of the class a better person at home. Do we advertise that? You can't market that stuff, but it happens. And that's part of the RLF. This experience that the people go through, is, a life-changing experience is the kind of phrase that we hear from so many that come through it. And it has to be built upon the trust in that room. It has to be built on being able to share what you're really thinking. If I disagree with a point you just made, I've got to have the ability to say I don't agree. Or why do you believe so deeply in that? Because I don't think that way. And I have to be able to uncover the biases that I have and be secure in where I'm coming from. Does that make sense?
So you said that everybody has a story. Can Can you tell us a few memorable stories? You can change the names if you like, or specifics on stories that have happened that really impressed you or kind of horrified you maybe sometimes.
Well, the story is it's not like a fable of any kind. The story of how people made it. It's so variable. I don't have a specific. Let me tell you about Charlie Brown. It's the how did I get there? I mean, in my own case, when I look back at it, I talked about the word synchronicity, and how things happen, and are you ready to understand and accept the way things are coming out. I often talk about the fact if I hadn't failed physics in my second semester in college, I'd have never married my wife. How do you string all of that together? Because that stopped me from becoming a dentist. That put me into a business school at Northwestern, where I wound up meeting my wife and eventually marrying her. It's like going to work for IBM because I was having coffee with the placement director who asked me to do a favor. I wound up going to work for IBM. So I don't have a story which says, gee, here's this guy who started at PepsiCo, who wound up becoming the CIO at Pepperidge Farm, and then wound up becoming the CIO of Campbell Soup. And now he's a guest speaker for us every time for the last 12 years. I mean, that's a progression. And what did he do differently? Well, I know what he started as in 1996. And I know where he is today. Did RLF do that all for him? Certainly not. He had to do it himself. Did RLF help him? I hope so. Am I sure about that? Can't say. Because it's up to the individual. So I can't just say RLF did it all. So I don't know how to tell you a story specific to an individual.
Okay. The RLF is said to be, as you said, a life-changing experience, and everybody that I've talked to has said the same thing, everybody that's been through the program. But how did it change your life, professionally and personally, besides enjoying seeing people learn from you?
In the very first year, one of the things that happened to me as I was talking to my mother about this thing I was doing, and one of the things she asked me was, I wonder how your children will remember your father. And my father was deceased at the time. And I thought about that, and I said, gee, I wonder how my grandchildren will remember me. So I sat down and I began to write down what I thought I was all about, what I believed in, what I thought about, what was important to me. And this is a document that wound up being 8 typewritten pages. It talked about my thinking about family, my thinking about work, my thinking about music. I can't remember all the pieces as I just sit here. But it was kind of who I thought I was, what was important to me, my personal values, how I made decisions, and about a page and a half of my best memories. And then I put together this packet, and it was this 8-page thing and a cover letter, and I sent it to every member of my family, individually. Not just my wife, but my 3 kids, their spouses. At that time, I had a 4-year-old granddaughter. I sent it to her, mailed it to all of these people. My daughter was married at the time. And I said, if I had one day to live, you guys would be the ones I would want to spend it with. That's why you're getting this document. I want you to know what I think I am all about. And the first one to call me was my son-in-law, who said to me, "Are you trying to tell us something?" He thought maybe I was going to die. But it forced them to think about what they were all about. Now, we do write a 2-page personal life story as an exercise in the RLF. And it's one of those things where you have to sit back and say, what are all the things that have impacted me life to date? What are the things that have made me who I am? And by the way, who am I? So that's what happened to me very first year. That's what it did. Now, every year I facilitate, and people say, doesn't it get boring? And the answer is no, because it gives me the opportunity for continuous learning. And, you know, my co-facilitators will do the same, say the same thing, I'm sure. We will go through the books. One of the interesting things, if you read the books, you know, like I did this past year, I read a book that we read in the very first year, and I haven't read it for a while. And I was looking at the highlights in the book, and they didn't make sense to me. Why would I want to highlight that now? Because the context of where my mind is and where my values are have shifted enough that that's no longer important. But here's something that is, because it's different, because I'm learning more things now. So I learn every year from the class. I too learn from that class. And it's exciting. It gives me a new way of thinking things. Personal life story, we limit them to 2 pages. Some would like to make it the great American novel, I know that. Some can't get past a paragraph. It's hard to do. I've thought about maybe I should update that 8 pages, because that's a long time ago. I only had 1 grandchild, now I got 5, so, and now they're starting to get married, so it's a lot different context. But that's one of the things that came out of all of that is this thing called The Kernel of Power, which is one of the books we read. And it's allowed me to discover my own kernel of power, my mission in life. So that makes me very comfortable. It's exciting for me. I know why I'm here. I don't know if that makes sense. It does to me.